February 12, 1944, 0410 hours, a frozen tree line west of Shepetivka in western Ukraine. The ground trembled beneath the treads of 16 Tiger I tanks as the men of Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, Germany's most experienced heavy battalion, waited for the signal to advance. Snow drifted across their hulls. Frost clung to the edges of their 80mm KWK-36L56 barrels. In the command tank, Hauptmann Helmut Wöhler studied a Soviet map recovered the previous night. It showed multiple red arrows pushing west, converging toward the very road his battalion was ordered to keep open. The Tigers were supposed to relieve encircled German infantry elements, withdrawing toward the town of Tarnopol. Instead, they were now facing reports of at least 2 Soviet tank brigades moving in their direction with T-34s, Su-76, and, according to uncertain intelligence, several Su-152 assault guns. At 0411 hours, a distant artillery roll echoed across the plain. Soviet guns, 100 Winged Siedlungsleiter howitzers, and 76 Semix divisional guns began walking fire across the German defensive belt. The opening barrage was not heavy by Eastern Front standards, but it was precise. Soviet forward observers had marked every known German strongpoint the day before. Shells hit supply trucks, ammunition caches, and the forward command post of a grenadier regiment positioned to support the Tigers. Wöhler watched a ripple of explosions far to the east, each burst chewing fresh craters into the snow. He estimated at least 3 batteries targeting his sector. The barrage intensified, shifting westward in careful increments. It was exactly the kind of creeping preparation the Red Army had learned to perfect over the previous year. He radioed the battalion's 2nd Company. The reply came back with static and alarm. Soviet armor was already moving. At least 20 T-34s were observed at 2,800 meters, maneuvering at full speed along a forest trail that hadn't been scouted the previous day. The Soviets were ahead of schedule by at least an hour. That meant their attack plan, whatever its full scope, was already unfolding. And Schwer Panzerabteilung 503, though equipped with some of the most formidable tanks in the world, was about to be thrown into a 72-hour battle that would test not just armor thickness or firepower, but the entire logistical framework that kept German heavy armor functioning in sub-zero weather. At 0413 hours, Wöhler issued the order, advanced to firing positions. The Tigers roared forward, engines, Maybach HL-230s, throbbing in the cold, black exhaust staining the white air. Their 56-ton chassis rolled across snow-packed earth already churned by retreating infantry. Each tank carried only enough fuel for about 80 kilometers of tactical movement. Each 80mm gun had a limited number of armor-piercing rounds. Most Tigers carried between 60 and 70 shells. In a prolonged engagement, resupply under fire would become nearly impossible. The Soviet barrage continued to grow, joined now by the heavy tremor of tank engines approaching from the northeast. For the moment, though, the Tigers still held the advantage of night, discipline, and long-range optics. Then, at 0414 hours, Wöhler saw the glow, small at first, then rising. Soviet flares burst overhead, turning the winter darkness into blinding arcs of green-white light. The battlefield lit up like a stage. Across the plain, shadows of dozens of moving tanks danced across the snow. The 503rd had been exposed. Their silhouettes, unmistakable with their tall turrets and straight armor lines, were now targets for the advancing Soviet gunners. In that instant, Wöhler understood the danger. The next 72 hours would not be a measured counterattack or a controlled withdrawal. It would be an inferno of continuous contact, burning through fuel, ammunition, and men faster than the Germans could replace them. And even for the best-trained Tiger Battalion on the Eastern Front, such a storm would demand more than courage. It would demand a logistical miracle that Germany could no longer provide. This was how the great battalion entered the ordeal that would erase it almost completely in 3 days. Hauptmann Helmut Wöhler had taken command of Schwer Panzerabteilung 503 in late 1943 after its first 2 combat tours. Formed in May 1942, the battalion had distinguished itself in the fighting around Kharkov in early 1943, where its Tigers reportedly destroyed more than 200 Soviet tanks in multiple engagements. The Tiger's 80mm gun could penetrate a T-34 frontally at 1,500 meters. The Soviet model's sloped armor provided little protection against the velocity of German armor-piercing rounds. At closer ranges, even KV-1s were vulnerable. Trained crews in 503rd had learned to exploit the Tiger's long-range superiority, often engaging Soviet formations before they could reply effectively. Yet this firepower came at a cost. Each Tiger required enormous maintenance. Tracks stretched and broke under pressure. Torsion bars cracked in cold weather. Transmissions overheated. Engines consumed fuel at nearly double the rate of a Panzer IV. To keep one operational required dozens of mechanics and support vehicles, fuel trucks, recovery half-tracks, spare part carriers, machine shops. The battalion could field combat power only when its logistical infrastructure functioned at high capacity. In 1942 and early 1943, Germany still had enough support assets to keep heavy armor supplied. By early 1944, supply networks were degraded by Soviet offensives, partisans, Luftwaffe fuel shortages, and Germany's collapsing rail network. The battalion's movement toward Shepativka began on January 31st, 1944. This was during the second phase of the Soviet Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which aimed to push army groups south out of western Ukraine. The Red Army fielded multiple fronts, 1st Ukrainian Front under General Vatutin and 2nd Ukrainian Front under General Konev, pressing westward, with Tank Corps, Mechanized Corps, cavalry mechanized groups, and rifle divisions operating in layered combinations. Soviet formations had learned to exploit breakthroughs with speed, often stretching thin German reserves. The German response relied heavily on armored counterattacks. The 503rd, still considered an elite unit, was dispatched to stabilize the collapsing front, and by time for infantry divisions, attempting to withdraw along the Shepativka-Tarnopol corridor. On February 3rd at 0600 hours, the battalion's trains arrived at Zdolbanov rail junction. Offloading 16 operational Tigers took more than 2 hours, longer due to frozen clamps and jammed tracks. Mechanics worked with blowtorches to warm metal plates. The unit's soldiers, roughly 350 personnel, assembled equipment, ammunition, and fuel. By 10:30 hours, they began a westward road march toward Shepativka, covering 40 kilometers over snow-covered secondary roads. The battalion's fuel trucks struggled to keep pace. Several slid into ditches and required recovery. This movement highlighted the fragility of German logistics. Even before reaching the battlefield, fuel reserves were already lower than planned. On February 5th, at 1500 hours, reconnaissance elements of the 503rd made first contact with Soviet forward units east of Shepativka. A Soviet tank battalion from the 1st Tank Army probed German lines with 10 to 12 T-34s, supported by infantry riding on the hulls. Lieutenant Franz Wieck, commanding a platoon of 2 Tigers, engaged them at 1,200 meters. His first round destroyed the lead T-34. Second and third shots struck the column's center. The remaining Soviet tanks withdrew. Over the next 2 hours, the Tigers fired 21 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition and destroyed 8 tanks. It was a reminder of German tactical superiority when logistics, terrain, and surprise allowed the Tigers to operate at ideal engagement distances. But the operational picture was deteriorating fast. Soviet infantry divisions poured westward. German infantry reported ammunition shortages. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel scarcity, could provide little to no air reconnaissance. Soviet Yak-9 fighters patrolled the skies, harassing German columns. By February 7th, Soviet tank brigades were bypassing German strongpoints entirely, advancing along forest trails and frozen rivers. The Germans lacked the manpower to seal every route. The 503rd was repeatedly forced to reposition to block breakthroughs, moving 10-20 kilometers per day in freezing winds. Each movement consumed scarce fuel. On February 8th, at 15 hours, the battalion reported 9 Tigers fully operational, 5 in repair, and 2 awaiting parts. The reduction was already severe, but not unexpected. Heavy battalions often had fewer than half their tanks ready for combat at any moment. But the crisis intensified as Soviet artillery, 100 Finne howitzers and 120 Sliwitter mortars targeted German supply columns. 2 fuel trucks were destroyed. 1 recovery half-track was lost. Ammunition stocks fell below the preferred minimum level of 50 armor-piercing rounds per tank. Despite these constraints, the Tigers repeatedly inflicted heavy losses on Soviet tank brigades attempting to break through German lines. On February 9th at 14:30 hours, the 503rd joined a counterattack alongside the 7th Panzer Division. Wöhler's Tigers advanced across open ground, firing at Soviet T-34s positioned along a shallow ridge. Soviet tanks attempted to close distance rapidly to bring their Svenningssimulator guns into effective range, but the 80mm guns fired faster and with greater accuracy. By 1600 hours, the Tigers had destroyed at least 14 enemy tanks. However, several Tigers were damaged by artillery fragments and mines. One suffered a broken final drive. Another developed engine trouble. The battalion now had just 12 operational Tigers. As reports of Soviet advances mounted, the German High Command issued new instructions. The battalion was ordered to position itself between 2 retreating infantry divisions to prevent encirclement. Soviet forces were maneuvering to cut off the Shepativka-Tarnopol road entirely. If they succeeded, thousands of German soldiers would be trapped. On February 11th, at 2000 hours, Wöhler convened his company commanders. By lantern light in a frozen farmhouse, he explained the next mission: hold the road at all costs for at least 48 hours. If the Soviets cut the corridor, the German retreat would collapse. The Tigers were to operate as mobile fire brigades, shifting rapidly between crisis points, but their ability to do so depended entirely on fuel and maintenance crews, whose workloads had tripled in recent days. By 2330 hours, the battalion was in position along a series of shallow ridges overlooking the road. Infantry support was thin, snow fell lightly, muffling distant artillery. Soviet forces were expected to attack at dawn. That quiet tension, that moment before the storm, led directly to the scene described earlier. So for 10 hours on February 12th, when the Soviet barrage opened and the Tigers were thrown into the first phase of the 72-hour Inferno that would consume them. As the flares burst overhead and Soviet armor advanced across the plain, the battalion's tactical strengths were intact, but its logistical weaknesses and the overwhelming weight of Soviet manpower, artillery, and mechanized reserves were about to collide with brutal intensity. The battle that followed would show how even the best heavy tank battalion in the German army could be exhausted, isolated, and shattered by relentless operational pressure, failing logistics, and the harsh arithmetic of the Eastern Front in 1944. The barrage intensified at 04:15 hours as Soviet artillery shifted fire deeper into the German positions. The snow that had muffled movement the previous night now amplified every explosion, sending shockwaves rolling across the plain. Wöhler watched the horizon through his binoculars, seeing the silhouettes of T-34s emerging from the tree line at 2,500 meters. Soviet tank brigades rarely advanced in neat formations by 1944. Instead, they pressed forward in staggered waves, designed to overwhelm German firepower and exploit any crack in the line. Behind the first wave came infantry, riding on tank hulls, and behind them, the heavier shapes of Su-76s and Su-152s. At 04 on 17 hours, Wöhler gave the fire command. 16 Tigers opened up almost simultaneously. Their 88mm guns roared, the shock of each shot echoing across the frozen earth. Armor-piercing shells streaked across the snow, striking the lead T-34s at ranges well beyond Soviet effective fire. 2 exploded immediately, another ground to a halt, turret blown open. Soviet tankers continued pressing forward, engines revving at full throttle. By 04:25 hours, the Tigers had destroyed more than a dozen enemy tanks, but the Soviet advance did not slow. The Red Army was not attempting a fine maneuver. It was applying mass of armor, mass of artillery, mass of men, to crush the German corridor before dawn. And for every tank knocked out at long range, 2 more appeared from the tree line. At 04:32 hours, the Soviet artillery shifted again. Now the barrage fell behind the Tigers, targeting German infantry support and supply units. Wöhler recognized the tactic immediately. Isolate the heavy tanks, overwhelm their limited ammunition stores, and force them to fight alone until breakdowns and fuel shortages did the rest. Soviet doctrine had evolved drastically since 1941, and this operation reflected a level of planning and coordination that German intelligence had underestimated. As the first hour wore on, the 503rd repositioned to new ridgelines to maintain standoff distance. But each movement burned precious fuel. By 05:20 hours, several Tigers reported low levels. Some had already consumed 40% of their reserves. Ammunition was also falling. The long-range duel demanded continuous fire. Tigers carried roughly 60 rounds, but only half of these were armor-piercing. After 40 to 50 shots, a Tiger's combat effectiveness declined sharply. Wöhler radioed for an ammunition resupply. But the roads behind them were now under Soviet artillery fire. At 05:40 hours, the first mechanical failure occurred. Tiger 231 reported a broken final drive, a common issue in the heavy vehicle, especially under cold conditions. The crew abandoned the immobilized tank and fought their way back on foot. Minutes later, Tiger 214 threw a track while maneuvering across frozen ruts. Soviet infantry, seeing the opportunity, advanced rapidly. The crew managed to destroy sensitive equipment before withdrawing. By 0600 hours, the battalion had been reduced to 12 operational Tigers. The Soviets escalated their attack at 615 hours. A second wave of T-34s advanced directly into the German line, screening a group of Su-152s positioned farther back. The Su-152, armed with a 150mm howitzer, could destroy a Tiger with a single hit at close range. Though its accuracy at long distances was poor, Soviet commanders knew that once the firefight compressed under 800 meters, their assault guns could change the balance instantly. At 06:22 hours, Tiger 221 was hit by a 76mm armor-piercing shell from a flanking T-34. The round failed to penetrate, but the impact jammed the turret traverse. The crew continued firing manually, but rate of fire dropped significantly. Within minutes, the tank was struck again, this time by a 122mm artillery fragment that severed communication lines. Cut off from the command net, the tank fought independently until retreating infantry covered its withdrawal. By 06:30 hours, the Soviet attack had achieved its first operational objective. They had pinned the 503rd in position, forcing the battalion to expend fuel and ammunition at a rate they could not sustain. At 0700 hours, Wöhler received a message from the division command. The Soviet 1st Tank Army had broken through German positions farther north and was attempting to cut the road behind the Tigers. If successful, the battalion would be encircled. Worse, a Soviet mechanized brigade was reported moving rapidly toward the German supply routes, threatening the fuel trucks and ammunition carriers that were the battalion's lifeline. By 0730 hours, Wöhler faced a critical choice: remain in place and risk encirclement, or conduct a fighting withdrawal to preserve the tanks for a later counterattack. He chose mobility. The 503rd began to fall back in a series of defensive bounds, firing, repositioning, firing again. But every kilometer cost fuel they no longer had. As the battalion retreated westward, Soviet forces exploited the opening. At 0815 hours, a Soviet tank brigade attempted a breakthrough along the road, hoping to collapse the corridor entirely. German infantry, scattered and depleted, relied on the Tigers to halt the advance. Tigers 132 and 134 engaged the lead Soviet vehicles at 900 meters, destroying 5 T-34s in quick succession. But as they repositioned, Soviet artillery found the range. A barrage of 122 shells boxed in their movement. One round landed directly beside Tiger 132, blowing track segments into the air and rupturing the left fuel tank. The crew escaped as flames spread across the hull. By 0930 hours, the battalion was down to 9 operational Tigers. The second phase of the 72-hour Inferno began around 1100 hours, when the Soviets extended their offensive southward. A mechanized brigade drilled through German lines protecting a small village, serving as the 503rd supply hub. Fuel trucks, medical vehicles, and ammunition carriers were overrun. By the time the German rearguard re-established control, the damage was irreversible. 2 fuel trucks burned, 1 ammunition truck overturned, and several support vehicles abandoned. Without fuel, the Tigers could not maneuver. Without ammunition, they could not fight. At 12:05 hours, Wöhler reorganized his remaining tanks into 2 ad hoc companies. First company, with 5 Tigers, formed a mobile defense force to repel Soviet armor. Second company, with 4 operational tanks, was tasked with escorting retreating infantry toward Tarnopol. This fragmentation diluted the battalion's concentrated power, but the alternative was collapse along the entire line. That afternoon, the Soviet attack intensified. The Soviet tank corps advanced with more than 60 tanks supported by massed artillery. German infantry broke under the pressure. The Tigers attempted to cover the retreat, but faced overwhelming numbers. At 1315 hours, Tiger 111 suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Its transmission seized during a rapid pivot. The crew abandoned the vehicle under fire. Minutes later, Tiger 122 was struck by an Su-152 shell at close range. The projectile smashed through the frontal plate, killing the driver and radio operator instantly. The rest of the crew escaped through the rear hatch. By 1500 hours, the battalion had only 7 operational tanks. That evening, temperatures dropped to 12 degrees C. Frozen mud hardened into jagged formations that tore at the Tigers' tracks. The battalion's surviving maintenance crews worked non-stop to repair damaged tanks. They cannibalized parts from disabled Tigers, but the lack of fuel meant that even repaired vehicles could not be fully tested. At 0200 hours on February 13th, the Soviets launched a night attack. Flares lit the sky over the German positions. Waves of infantry advanced behind the light of burning German vehicles. The Tigers fired high explosive rounds to break up infantry formations. But each detonation consumed ammunition they could not replace. By dawn on the second day, the battalion was reduced to 5 operational tanks. The third day, February 14th, brought the final collapse. At 0610 hours, a Soviet armored force struck the German corridor from both north and south. Encirclement was imminent. German infantry, exhausted and freezing, began withdrawing in small groups. Wöhler's Tigers attempted a final counterattack to keep the corridor open long enough for retreating units to escape. Tiger 301, Wöhler's command tank, led the effort. It destroyed 3 T-34s at 600 meters, then 2 more at 400 meters as the Soviets pushed closer. But at 0645 hours, a Soviet anti-tank gun, 76mm ZIS-3, scored a hit on the Tiger's running gear, blowing off a road wheel and immobilizing it. Wöhler ordered the crew to abandon the vehicle. At 0700 hours, Tiger 142 was struck by artillery fragments. Fire spread through the engine compartment. The crew bailed out. Tiger 153 threw a track while reversing over icy ground. Tiger 133 was lost to a direct hit from an Su-76 at close range. The last operational Tiger, Tiger 131, continued fighting until 0730 hours when it ran out of fuel. Its crew set demolition charges and withdrew. By 0800 hours, Schwer Panzer Abteilung 503 no longer existed as a fighting force. The entire battalion, once considered the pinnacle of German armored warfare, had been wiped out in 72 hours. Not by superior tactics, not by better tanks, but by massed Soviet firepower, relentless operational tempo, collapsing German logistics, and mechanical attrition that no repair crew could keep ahead of. The corridor to Tarnopol briefly remained open, but the cost was catastrophic. The loss of the 503rd signaled the end of German heavy armor dominance on the Eastern Front. From this moment forward, the Tigers no longer acted as battlefield kings. They were isolated giants in a war defined by movement, numbers, and supply. The lesson was clear. Even the most powerful tank is only as strong as the system that supports it. Heavy armor could win battles. Logistics decided campaigns. Industrial capacity decided wars. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.